The cemetery was never a place of comfort, but for Margaret, it had always been strangely familiar, almost like an extension of her own haunted memories. She worked nights at the small church on the edge of town, cleaning pews and refilling candle trays, and sometimes, when a loneliness pressed too tightly against her ribs, she wandered into the rows of crooked gravestones where the air felt colder and time itself seemed to pause. It was on one of those nights, under a bruised sky with the moon barely glowing behind the clouds, that she heard it, the faintest sound, so small it seemed impossible, the cry of a baby. At first she thought it was just the wind whistling through the cracks of the headstones, but then it came again, sharper this time, undeniably human, undeniably helpless. Her blood froze, her hands trembled as she gripped the lantern tighter, and she whispered to herself, "No, no, this can't be." Yet her feet moved before her mind could resist, leading her toward the oldest corner of the graveyard, where weeds wrapped around forgotten names. And there, beneath a stone angel leaning on its broken wings, was a bundle of blankets, damp from the night air, and inside, a baby boy, his face red from crying, his eyes too wide for a newborn, staring straight into hers as if he had been waiting only for her. Margaret's knees buckled, not just from shock, but from something deeper, something primal, as though fate itself had dragged her to this moment. She should have called the police, she knew that, but instead she scooped him into her arms, pressing his warmth against her chest, and whispered, "You're safe now. I'll keep you safe." She had no idea who left him there, no clue why anyone would abandon a child in such a cursed place. But one thing pulsed in her mind like a vow carved into her very bones. This child was hers now, whether the world agreed or not. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that 30 years later, the same child she carried away that night would return to this cemetery, not as the baby who once needed saving, but as the man who would stand over her grave with a shovel in his hands. And yet, that night, none of the shadows warned her. None of the graves whispered the truth. Margaret named the baby Samuel after her grandfather, and though she lived in a crumbling apartment with little money and no family of her own, she raised him with fierce devotion. Every night, she wondered about his origins. Was his mother someone who had died and left him behind, or worse, someone who had chosen the cemetery as a cradle of rejection? But every time she stared into Samuel's eyes, those questions melted into something more terrifying, a feeling that he didn't quite belong to her world, that something in his gaze carried secrets older than his fragile body. Neighbors questioned her story, whispered in the grocery aisles, "A baby in a cemetery? Sounds like she made it up." But Margaret didn't care. She knew what she had seen, she knew what she had heard, and deep inside, she knew the cemetery hadn't given her a child by accident. It had given her a story, one that wasn't finished yet. What she thought was a miracle of motherhood was in fact the beginning of her undoing, a circle that would close in blood and silence. For now, though, all she saw was the tiny boy who had stopped crying in her arms, the boy who seemed to breathe in sync with her heartbeat. She thought she had saved him, but as the cemetery's gates creaked shut behind her, if Margaret had looked back, if she had just glanced once more at the angel statue where the baby had been lying, she would have seen the strangest thing. The stone lips curved into a faint smile. Eliza Hart, the frail woman with silver-streaked auburn hair that fell loosely around her pale face, and eyes that always seemed rimmed with exhaustion, could not sleep that night. Her tiny house at the edge of the village was cloaked in silence. Yet inside her head there was only noise, the echo of the infant's cry from the cemetery, a cry so piercing it had seemed stitched into her very veins. Every time Eliza closed her tired blue eyes, she saw again the crooked gravestones, the half-sunken crosses, and the baby's fragile body wrapped in a threadbare white blanket stained by soil and time. Her hands, always trembling slightly from nerves, remembered how light the baby had been, as though the child was no more than a shadow or a whisper. But the baby was real, warm, breathing, and she could not erase that. The fire in her hearth had burned down to embers, casting flickering shadows across her living room, when Eliza thought she saw movement in the corner. She jerked upright on her chair, her frail hands gripping the armrest. There was no one, only the old wooden chair, the creaking floorboards, the peeling wallpaper. But then the sound came again, a soft, rattling sob, like a baby choking back its tears. Eliza Hart, her wrinkled face tightening in terror, staggered toward the sound. She pushed open her bedroom door and froze. The cradle that had been empty for 29 years, ever since her stillborn daughter had been buried, was rocking gently on its own that Eliza's body nearly gave out. She gripped the doorframe, her knuckles pale. The cradle was not only rocking, it was filled. The same baby from the cemetery, the baby she had carried home, was now lying inside it, cooing softly, its tiny fists clenched, its eyes an unnatural shade of deep black that reflected no light. Eliza's lips trembled. She whispered, What do you want from me?" Her words cracked like dry wood. The baby's gaze locked onto hers, and though its lips did not move, Eliza heard a voice, soft as earth, inside her skull. "Asterisk, you brought me home, and now you will keep me." That night stretched like a curse. Eliza tried to sleep, but every time she drifted into unconsciousness, she was shaken awake by the sound of a baby's laugh or the faint rustle of tiny feet crawling across her floor. She would light her lantern, her aged, thin hands trembling, and find nothing. Yet when she looked into the cradle, the baby was always there, swaddled, unmoving, as if it had been sleeping the whole time. The confusion tormented her, eating away at her already fragile sanity. Days turned into weeks. Eliza, once known in the village as the eccentric woman who wore black shawls and kept to herself, became something else entirely. She stopped opening her shutters. Her garden withered. The villagers whispered. Some claimed they saw her carrying a bundle in her arms at midnight, rocking it under the dead oak near the churchyard. Others swore they heard lullabies drifting from her house, though Eliza had no family. And Eliza herself, she was shrinking, hollowing out. Her cheekbones jutted sharply from her pale face, her once bright blue eyes dulled to ash, and her lips cracked from murmuring lullabies endlessly to the baby she never named. The baby grew, but not in the way a human child should. It did not crawl, it did not babble, it did not cry for milk. It simply existed, always in the cradle, always watching Eliza with those bottomless black eyes. And sometimes at night, when the wind howled, Eliza swore she saw the baby standing in her hallway, its small figure swaying in the shadows, its pale skin glowing faintly in the dark. Yet by morning, it was always back in the cradle, waiting. One evening, when the church bells tolled for midnight, there was a knock on Eliza's door. Slow, hollow, reluctant. She hesitated, clutching her candle, her heart quaking in her chest. Outside stood Father Jonah, the village priest, a tall, gaunt man with gray hair, deep-set green eyes, and a black robe that looked heavier than the man himself. He smelled faintly of incense and damp stone, and his expression was one of quiet dread. "Eliza," he said in a grave voice, "they tell me you've been keeping something that does not belong among the living." Eliza, her frail hands clutching the doorframe, shook her head violently. "You don't understand, Father. It was crying. Alone. Someone left it there in the cemetery. How could I walk away?" Her cracked voice broke, but Father Jonah's eyes hardened. He leaned in, lowering his tone. "That child is not of God. It is something else, something old. If you keep it here, it will root itself in you. You must let me take it." The baby cried from inside the house. Both of them turned toward the sound. Eliza's body jolted as though lightning had struck her. "No," she screamed, her wrinkled face twisted in terror. "You won't take it from me. Not again. Not another child." Her voice cracked, spilling decades of grief. Father Jonah's jaw clenched. "Eliza, if you don't surrender it willingly, you'll damn your soul." Eliza slammed the door in his face, her breath ragged. She pressed her back against it, her thin frame trembling violently. From the cradle, the baby cooed, its black eyes glinting as though amused. Eliza stumbled toward it, whispering to herself, "You're mine now. No one will take you, not even God." And in that moment, for the first time, the baby smiled. But the smile was not a child's. It was ancient, cruel, stretched too wide for its small face. Eliza's heart dropped into her stomach, but she couldn't look away. She knew, deep inside, that she had not rescued the baby from the cemetery. She had brought the cemetery home with her. Margaret Dawson could not sleep for nights after the cemetery discovery, her wrinkled hands trembling each time she tried to hold her tea mug, her eyes fixed on the old photograph of the baby she had once carried out of the cold graveyard 3 decades earlier. The baby who had grown into Samuel, the quiet, solemn man who now lived in her house like a restless ghost, his tall frame and gaunt features moving silently through the hallways at night as though haunted by a memory he could not name. Every creak of the wooden floors sent shivers down Margaret's spine because it was not just Samuel who had returned to her life. It was the weight of secrets she thought had long been buried. Samuel, with his sharp cheekbones and sunken eyes that seemed older than his 30 years, had begun spending long hours in the cemetery, kneeling at a place Margaret had never dared to visit again, near the row of unmarked graves where she had once stumbled upon him as an infant. When she asked him why, his deep, almost hollow voice replied, "I can hear them call my name. Margaret, they want me back." And the way his pale lips curled when he spoke made her clutch her rosary tighter, though her faith seemed to crumble in the face of such unnatural truth. Her neighbors had started whispering. Mrs. Callahan swore she had seen Samuel digging at night, a shovel over his shoulder, his silhouette outlined by the silver moon, his coat flapping in the cold wind. But Margaret dismissed it aloud, though inside her chest panic grew like a storm, because she too had heard the metallic clang of metal striking earth from her bedroom window at ungodly hours. That evening, Margaret followed Samuel, her thin frame wrapped in a faded cardigan, her steps unsteady but her determination sharp, and what she saw nearly froze her blood. There in the cemetery, Samuel stood waist-deep in a freshly dug pit, his shovel resting on the side. And when he looked up at her, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, he whispered, "It's ready now," as though the grave was not for someone who had died, but for someone who still lived. Margaret stumbled backward, clutching her chest, whispering, "God help me." But Samuel climbed out with eerie calmness, his tall figure looming over her, his hollow eyes softening only for a brief second as he reached to steady her shaking body. "Don't be afraid, Margaret," he said, his voice strangely gentle yet chilling. "It's not death I'm digging for, it's truth." That night, she dreamt of her younger self again, walking through the cemetery with the wailing infant in her arms. Only now the infant's cries were replaced with words that said, "Why did you take me?" And she woke with sweat dripping down her temples, realizing that Samuel's existence itself was a question she had never answered. By dawn, Samuel sat by the kitchen table, his long fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup, his clothes still damp with cemetery dirt, and he said quietly, "I know you wonder, Margaret, why I was there, why I was abandoned, but the grave knows, and soon you will too." His words struck her harder than the cold morning air, because for the first time in 30 years, Margaret realized she might not have saved him from the grave. She might have stolen him from it. The summer heat pressed against Eleanor's skin as she sat on her old wooden porch, staring at the distant outline of the cemetery that had haunted her life for 3 decades. Her silver-streaked hair clung to her forehead in the humidity, and her trembling hands gripped the edges of the rocking chair that creaked beneath her weight. She could not get the boy, now a grown man, out of her mind. James, his tall frame, lean but powerful, with roughened hands that betrayed years of toil, stood in her memory as clearly as if he were standing right in front of her. His eyes, those piercing, storm-gray eyes she had first seen in the cemetery 30 years ago when he was only a baby, were burned into her thoughts, carrying both pain and questions she could no longer suppress. The days since his reappearance had been torture. He had not returned after their first encounter, and the silence gnawed at her more violently than any words could. In the evenings, when the cicadas shrieked and the shadows grew long, Eleanor thought she saw him lingering by the cemetery gates, tall and ghostly against the fading light. She would blink, and he would be gone, leaving her heart pounding in her chest like the frantic beating of wings. At night, she dreamed of the moment she found him in that graveyard, the moonlight on his tiny, crying face, his fragile body wrapped in a cloth spotted with dirt, the scent of damp earth all around them. She remembered cradling him in her arms as if it had happened yesterday, her young hands trembling, her heart overwhelmed by the weight of what she had done by taking him home. That secret had shaped her entire life, carving scars into her soul she had hidden even from herself. Now, James had returned, not as a lost child, but as a man carrying the unspoken truth of a bond born in a graveyard, and she could feel that he was holding something back, something darker than she dared to imagine. Eleanor rose from her chair, her joints aching with the burden of time, and walked slowly toward the cemetery path. The sky was heavy with clouds, the kind that promised a storm, and the air smelled faintly of rain and earth. The gates stood before her, rusted and imposing, and as she touched the cold iron, she swore she felt the echo of that first night ripple through her veins. She pushed the gates open and stepped onto the gravel path, her heart beating a rhythm of fear and longing. She walked among the headstones, each one whispering stories of death, love, and secrets. And then she saw him. James stood by an open grave, his tall silhouette framed against the dark sky, his broad shoulders tense, his muscular arms gripping a shovel that glinted under the flickering light of a lantern beside him. His rugged face was set in stone, his chiseled jaw clenched, and those storm-gray eyes met hers with a look that pierced through her heart. "Why are you digging?" Eleanor's voice cracked as she called out, her hand clutching the folds of her faded dress to steady herself. James didn't answer right away. His dark, slightly disheveled hair clung to his forehead with sweat, and his chest rose and fell heavily beneath his worn shirt, soaked through with labor. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep and raw, filled with restrained fury. "Because the truth has been buried long enough," he said, his words cutting through the silence like the blade of his shovel. Eleanor's knees nearly gave way, and she stumbled closer, her eyes locked on him. "What truth?" she whispered, her breath ragged, her throat dry. James lifted another pile of earth, the muscles in his forearms tightening with the effort, and then he looked up at her again, his face illuminated by the dim lantern glow. "The truth about me, about you, about why I was left here." His words carried the weight of 30 years of silence, and Eleanor felt her chest tighten as if invisible hands were crushing her ribs. She wanted to run, to deny, to erase the moment, but her feet remained rooted to the ground as her soul screamed for air. The wind picked up, rattling the branches of the ancient trees, scattering dead leaves across the headstones. A drop of rain landed on Eleanor's cheek, and then another, as if the sky itself wept for the sins buried in the earth. James thrust the shovel deep into the soil again, his storm-gray eyes never leaving hers. "This grave," he said slowly, his voice trembling with rage, "is the beginning and the end. And you know it." Eleanor's lips trembled as she tried to speak, but no sound came out. Her silver-streaked hair whipped across her face in the rising wind, and her wrinkled hands shook as they reached out toward him. She wanted to tell him everything, to confess the secret that had rotted inside her for 30 years. But as she opened her mouth, the storm broke and the rain poured down, drowning her words in a torrent of guilt and fear. The cemetery had become both a prison and a revelation for Margaret. Every night she returned. Every night she swore she would not come back, and yet the pull of 30 years of silence and the echo of the crying infant she once saved dragged her down the same gravel paths. The autumn chill was sharper now, the wind cutting like a knife as it rattled the dead leaves against the crooked gravestones, and she wrapped her shawl tighter around her frail shoulders. Her once strong frame, the body that had carried other people's secrets, now seemed to sag beneath the weight of her own. She was haunted by the fact that Daniel, once a baby, now a man with a face hardened like stone, was not just someone from her past, but her judge, her shadow, her unfinished story demanding its ending. That night, Margaret wandered back to the grave where she had found him 3 decades ago, the very spot where a baby in a torn white blanket, face red from endless crying, had been abandoned. She traced her fingers over the cracked headstone, moss climbing like veins over the name she could barely read, and whispered, "I should have told you the truth. Daniel. But the truth would have destroyed both of us. Her words trembled in the night air as a deep voice answered behind her. You mean the truth would have freed me, Margaret? She spun around, and there he was, Daniel, tall, broad-shouldered, his weathered trench coat snapping against the wind, his face a mirror of anguish and fury, those dark eyes burning with a mix of betrayal and longing. His scarred hands clutched a shovel, dirt already caked along the edges, and for a moment, Margaret saw him as he had been in her nightmares. The boy turned gravedigger, the child she rescued, now the man who could bury her. Daniel stepped closer, his boots crunching against brittle leaves, and every step echoed like the toll of a bell. You raised me in silence, Margaret. You gave me a name, but never a story. Who left me here? Who thought I was better off in the ground than alive? His voice cracked, the pain of 30 years bleeding through the cracks of rage. Margaret's lips quivered as she tried to answer, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she reached out a trembling hand, her pale, wrinkled fingers desperate to touch him. Daniel, you were never meant to suffer. I thought I was saving you. His jaw tightened, and he took a step back, shaking his head as if her touch would burn him. Saving me, he spat, his voice a low snarl. I've been nothing but a shadow, a whisper in every room, a man with no history, no family, no truth. Do you know what it's like to live in borrowed skin? His fury cut deep, and Margaret fell silent, because she did know her entire life had been a borrowed one, filled with lies and silences stitched together like the shroud of a corpse. The night grew heavier, the clouds swallowing the moon, plunging the cemetery into suffocating darkness. Margaret's chest heaved as she tried to speak again, forcing the truth she had buried deeper than any coffin. Your mother, she was not some stranger, Daniel. She was a girl, terrified, no older than 16. She came here in the dead of night, holding you with shaking hands, tears streaming down her face. She whispered one word before leaving you, forgive, and ran into the darkness. I never saw her again. The confession spilled from her lips like blood, and Daniel froze, his breath catching, his grip tightening on the shovel. Her name, he demanded, his voice barely above a whisper. Tell me her name. Margaret's eyes watered, the weight of decades pressing against her chest. Clara, she finally said, her voice cracking. Clara Whitmore. The name drifted into the air like a ghost, and Daniel's face changed. Not softer, but broken, shattered by the collision of rage and revelation. His mother had a name, a story, and yet Margaret's silence had stolen it from him for 30 years. He lifted the shovel, collapsing onto the damp grass, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. Her once proud voice now begged, desperate, fragile. If that's what you need, Daniel, if that's what it takes for you to be free, then do it. But know this, I never abandoned you. I carried you, I fed you, I gave you every piece of my life so you could have one. If silence was my crime, it was because I feared the truth would drown you before you learned how to swim. Her words were knives, raw, vulnerable, without shield, and for the first time, Daniel hesitated. He looked down at her, this woman who had both saved and damned him, and his grip on the shovel loosened. The night around them seemed to still, the cemetery holding its breath, waiting for judgment. That Daniel's voice dropped, soft but jagged. Then tonight, Margaret, you'll tell me everything. No more graves, no more silence. The truth, or the earth takes you. His words sealed the night like a curse, and Margaret nodded, her body trembling but her eyes finally resolute. She knew part 6, the final reckoning, was upon them, left them in Margaret's arm, crept over the cemetery, a fragile silver line cutting across the horizon. But the chill in the air made Margaret's frail body tremble, as if the night itself refused to release its grip. She stood at the edge of the grave, her wrinkled hands clutching the folds of her long gray coat, heart pounding like a drum against her chest, each beat echoing the fear and guilt she had carried for 30 years. Daniel, tall, imposing, and impossibly lean, with his pale skin, storm-gray eyes, and the scar under his left eye catching the faint morning glow, stood beside the shovel, silent, his muscular arms crossed, the air around him heavy with unspoken judgment. The grave, freshly dug, looked like a black void ready to swallow anyone who dared step too close, and Margaret felt the weight of her decades of lies pressing down on her like the earth above it. She whispered, her voice quivering, "I never meant for this. I never abandoned you, Daniel. I thought I was saving you, giving you life, giving you everything I could." His piercing eyes softened slightly, the hardness giving way to something raw, a mixture of pain, anger, and a deep, aching need for truth. Slowly, he placed the shovel into the grass, its metallic clang startling against the silence, and he knelt beside her, the early morning light illuminating his tall frame, the sharp angles of his face, and the intensity in his storm-gray eyes. "Then tell me everything, Margaret," he said, voice low but commanding, "every detail. No more graves, no more silence. Tonight, we finish this story." Margaret's trembling lips moved as she recounted the night she had found him in the cemetery, her voice breaking as she described the cold earth, the infant's cries, the fear, the desperation, and how she had carried him to safety despite her youth and terror. She told him about the girl, his mother, young and frightened, her face pale and tear-streaked, the hands that trembled, and how she had never known whether she could protect him from the world. Daniel listened, his storm-gray eyes glistening, the scar on his cheek catching the first rays of light, as the truth he had craved for 30 years spilled from Margaret's mouth like a river breaking through a dam. The ground beneath their feet seemed to hold its breath, the wind stilling, the crows silent in their trees, as if the earth itself waited for Daniel's verdict. Slowly, he extended his hand toward her, his long, pale fingers brushing her trembling ones. "I understand now," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. "You gave me life, and even if it was in pieces, you never left me entirely. That is the only grave I do not want to dig." Margaret fell to her knees, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks, her frail arms wrapping around his towering frame as he held her gently, his muscular arms surprisingly tender, the storm-gray eyes reflecting both grief and forgiveness. For the first time in 30 years, the air around them felt lighter, the weight of the past lifting with the rising sun. The cemetery, once a place of dread and haunted memories, now seemed calm, bathed in the golden light of dawn, the grave's quiet witnesses to a story of loss, pain, redemption, and the undeniable bond between a woman who had saved a baby and the man who had grown from it. As Margaret looked into Daniel's eyes, she realized that the grave she had once feared so deeply was no longer a place of punishment. It had become a testament to survival, forgiveness, and the fragile, unstoppable power of truth. The first rays of sunlight kissed their faces, and for the first time, Margaret smiled through her tears, knowing that the circle had closed. The story had ended, and the baby she had found 30 years ago had finally come home. Not to a grave, but to the truth. Asters, please like, comment, and subscribe for more emotional, gripping stories.